Much. Mary, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
I know that you've been on for a little bit. So guys, it's kind of fun to have Mary joining us because she's actually served on the board of a couple of these organizations, or maybe you even still do. It's a small little city here in Kansas City, right, Mary?
Yes, I looked at the people you have this afternoon and it feels like a virtual Old Home Week because I've either worked or volunteered with them closely as colleagues.
Yeah.
Small world.
Well, I know that you want to share your journey. I am a very loyal QuikTrip consumer. And during the whole COVID thing, really a lot of things have been impacted in my life, but not being able to get my mango tea at QuikTrip has just been awful. So thankfully I can get it again, right? So
right. That's
yeah.
great. That's great. Well, I first spoke with your organization shortly after I joined the QuikTrip Board. Katie invited me back then, so I'm honored by your invitation to bookend my QuikTrip Board service today, speaking with you about board leadership there and some reflections on leadership. So I'm often asked how I joined the QuikTrip Board, and the short answer I give is I was recruited by a headhunter. But the real answer is that I benefited from two very generous acts. Because Katie had made a personal visit to Catalyst, which is a New York-based nonprofit focused on women's leadership. She learned that QuikTrip was looking for a female board member with significant executive experience and lived in one of their markets. So Katie emailed Greater Missouri members, and I still have the email that I received from a Greater Missouri member who was a former Hallmark colleague I'd recently networked with about a community issue. So if Katie hadn't gone that extra mile to make an in-person visit in New York to Catalyst to find about their search, I wouldn't have known about the QuikTrip Board opportunity, which nicely is a paid position. And at the time I was in a very demanding job, working lots of hours, and I could have easily ignored that email about the search, except for the second act of generosity, which had taken place a few years before. I walked to my local QuikTrip with $1 in my pocket to buy a Sunday paper. But silly me didn't realize the paper cost $1.25 until I went to the counter to pay. So I was embarrassed and started to leave without the paper when the clerk said, QuikTrip would gladly loan me the quarter and I could pay it back on my next visit. Now, I was astounded because when does something like that happen? Yeah. And I fell in love with QuikTrip. The second question I often get is, how does QuikTrip find such great employees? Well, QuikTrip's purpose is to provide an opportunity for employers to grow and succeed. And that's in stark contrast to most corporations whose purpose is to maximize shareholder wealth. They promote nearly entirely from within. Employees typically start in the stores and work their way up. And they're perennially ranked nationally as the best place to work, which is not easy for a convenience store. They're also focused on employee communities. 5% of profits are donated to charity. And employees own over 16% of the company via an ESOP. So that issue about shareholder wealth creation is still relevant. Employees can spend their entire career working in the stores and retire as multimillionaires. The role of the QuikTrip Board is also different. The founding family owns more than 50% of the stock. It's a private company. And Chet Cadjo, the son of the founder, is chairman and CEO and basically controls the majority of shareholder votes. So the board's role is to primarily provide advice and insight, but also to represent the interest of minority shareholders. And we do that by focusing on three areas. The first is obviously strategy, the future direction that will allow QuikTrip to succeed, and we stay away from operational decisions. The second is risk, the classic fiduciary responsibilities, controls, and audits, but more importantly, being on the lookout for potential business risks. And the third is succession. We have a board meeting next week, and we'll give the CEO his performance review and also spend quite a bit of time discussing succession plans for key jobs. Oh, I've got some reflections on the leadership lessons from my board service, but as I look at them, I think they likely work in most leadership situations. When I joined the QuikTrip Board, I was the only woman, and I was about 20 years younger than the average board member. So the first thing I did was focusing on learning how things work. That, is it a foxtrot or a waltz here? It's far less formal at QuikTrip than I was used to at Hallmark. There's a lot of humor and joking in the board meeting. It's fun. It was also important to learn what or who are the sacred cows. And I learned, for example, that QuikTrip was very serious about their purpose and values. For instance, being verbally abusive to a subordinate will quickly get you fired. And I tried to get to know people. And one strategy I still use is to sit beside someone different in each board meeting. To make a difference and have an impact is very different in the boardroom where there isn't individual authority. You can't say, go do this as an individual. So you need to develop strategies for ways to influence. And different people respond to different approaches. In some cases, it's a personal relationship. Other times, it's the data that's convincing. And sometimes examples and anecdotes are really effective. And sometimes it's all three of those. So my first strategy for the QuikTrip Board, especially given my relative youth at the time, was to be prepared. I saw that was really valued at QuikTrip because I often heard the CEO say that Sandy, who had worked her way up without a college degree to be the highest ranking woman as CFO, was always the best prepared person in the room. And I still heavily prepare for meetings. Meeting prep takes me about 8 hours for each quarterly meeting, and that's about 45 minutes for every hour of meeting time. I do that by studying the quarterly board book, which is critical for information because really the only other formal update we get during the quarter is a monthly P&L. So the board book has a lot of rich information. And then most of what I do is to ask questions to build mutual understanding. I think you're more likely to be successful if you jointly map the terrain together with someone rather than start out with a direct challenge. So from the board packet, I make a list of questions, and they range from understanding an increase in legal costs in a particular market to assess changing risks to the impact of electric cars on gas consumption in the future of the company. But you can also gain great insight by asking general questions to probe, like, what about your job keeps you awake these days? And sometimes you ask questions to help develop people. You've probably all been in meetings when there's a deathly silence after someone presents a good but maybe boring report. And then you ask a question to show their work is valued. Like when the young female auditor gives a report with no big news, ask if anything was different this year versus last year. But I think it's also important to watch that you don't take too much airtime or you risk being ignored and ultimately then have less impact. With some issues, it helps to understand and recognize what best happens inside versus outside the boardroom. So you can catch the CEO over cocktails before dinner about a concern versus bringing it up for the first time in a board meeting. Or you discuss issues with other board members to get a read on significant topics when you're driving to or from the hotel. And I always have to remember that change takes time. It's a strategy I call Chinese water torture, where you bring up an issue many times and then you finally get traction. So sometimes the most impactful strategy, though, is to tell stories. And early on at QuikTrip, I thought the company was focusing too much on gasoline and needed to focus on inside sales. That was really the reason I was brought on the board. So I talked about things from my Hallmark experience, like tracking customer transaction growth and implementing loyalty programs or analyzing competitive moves in products, and kind of wasn't getting very far with that approach. Until I told a story from the movie Jurassic Park about velociraptors. Now, you may remember velociraptors are scary and fast and smart dinosaurs. And there's a very tense scene where a scientist is faced with a velociraptor that's about to attack him, but the scientist has aimed his gun at him and is about to pull the trigger and get him when he's attacked from the side by one that he didn't see. And finally, the message got through that if you focus too much on one thing, you can get killed. And it was a metaphor that worked. The story of the velociraptor was referenced for actually years afterwards. Next week is my last board meeting, and undoubtedly COVID-19 is going to be a topic of conversation. QuikTrip started doing enterprise risk management planning at the request of the board several years ago. And of the enterprise risk, you could count on two hands. A natural disaster, a pandemic was one of them. It was kind of an intellectual exercise because we didn't imagine it actually would happen. And quite honestly, not many of the tactics were relevant over the last few months. But the basis for decisions that was identified through that exercise was relevant. And that basis for the decisions was to protect and decide quickly. Obviously, one key focus was on protecting employees. So management quickly made policy decisions very early. There would be no layoffs. QuikTrip has never had a layoff, and that still holds true. So even though things had slowed a lot in the stores, if you wanted to work, you had the opportunity to work. Or if you were scared and wanted a leave of absence, you got one and would still have a job at QuikTrip. Regarding what I know as of a couple of weeks ago on operational changes, and I'll learn more about next week, early in April, QuikTrip found enough masks to give at least 2 to every employee, and that's not easy when you need 36,000. And in cities where the infection rate is higher, like St. Louis and Atlanta, masks are worn all the time. In other cities with lower infection rates, it's optional, but obviously changes depending on advice for health professionals. One thing that hasn't changed from the start is cleaning the store every 30 minutes with hospital-grade disinfectant, something a lot of retailers struggle to do just a couple of times a day. And throughout the crisis, our CEO has communicated heavily with employees in the stores to motivate them, given the risk those on the front lines are taking. Strangely, sometimes crisis brings opportunity. We had tried to launch curbside delivery for a couple of years, but consumers weren't very interested. But during the shutdown, they were. So we finally fully implemented curbside delivery very quickly via our mobile app, and we're even able to advertise it. So, I was very fortunate to have gotten that email when QuikTrip wanted a female board member. But I was the only woman on the board for a couple of years. And in early meetings, I was looked to provide the women's point of view. And so sometimes I felt like an outsider. It's also like with comments, excuse my language, Mary, but it was much easier with the second female board member. But we quite honestly often talked in the bathroom about issues related to women. But then when a third woman came on the board, it was wonderful because it was totally integrated and we no longer had meetings in the bathroom. Actually, research from Catalyst, that firm that did the search that got me to the QuikTrip board, shows there's magic in reaching what they call a critical mass of 3 female board members. And they show that 3 or more women directors on the board correlates with better financial performance and also changes in the boardroom dynamics that foster a greater diversity of ideas and innovation. So finally, business is catching on to the value of women on boards. When I joined the QuikTrip board in 2000, women filled barely 11% of board seats in the S&P 500. And it didn't grow much over the next 10 years. In 2010, it was almost 13% of seats. But then it started increasing. And by 2018, it was 18% of board seats. And then it has grown dramatically. And as of just a few weeks ago, in the US, women now hold 28% of board seats in the S&P 500. And finally, last year, all S&P boards now include women. Yay. Well, looking back on the last 20 years, there are so many things that make a lot of sense in retrospect, like focusing on employees leads to greater business success. But if I look back on the last 20 weeks, it's so hard to make sense of things. The pandemic, the economic crisis, the police killing of George Floyd. You'd think in a year named 2020, things would look clear. But maybe that's the point, to make us see more clearly. One thing I clearly believe is that we are in a time that will be viewed in retrospect as a crucible of leadership for business and politics and society. And have you noticed that a disproportionate number of the countries coping best with the pandemic are led by women? It's New Zealand, Taiwan, Germany, Norway. It prompted a recent CNN headline, "Women are better leaders, the pandemic proves it."
Yeah.
So I owe a deep debt of gratitude to Greater Missouri for your gift of the last 20 years to serve on the QuikTrip Board. But also, as a native of Missouri, I appreciate your willingness as individuals to step up as leaders to address the critical issues facing our state and nation. So thank you.
That was great.